Welcome back to the Sparks by Ignium podcast. I'm the host of the show, and today I'm delighted to welcome back Urs Koenig. In our first episode, we talked about lots of areas of radical humility, including vulnerability. We talked about Urs's acceptance of himself when he, in his mind, failed in his ride across America, and what he had to do differently to come out of that with a different mindset. So now I'd love to pick up on that conversation and welcome him back to the show because there's more questions I've got, and I'm sure as listeners, you'll be eager to find out more about it. So Urs, welcome back to the Sparks by Ignium podcast.
It's great to be back, Phil. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. So now I want to pick up with a story. And you're a bit of a storyteller. I've watched many of your videos online. You've given over 300 speeches. And from anyone who wants to go and connect with us, we'll put the show notes together after this recording, and you'll be able to connect with him directly. And you'll be able to see some of the videos he put out because he is a master storyteller, master speaker. Urs, you spent some time in Syria at the time, and I'd love to pick on that in terms of what it was when you got appointed to become that Swiss national representative, because I think there's a story there which I think starts to elaborate on other things. So could you just fill in the background for that before we delve into?
Absolutely. So I was deployed in Lebanon actually at the time on the blue line, the ceasefire line between Israel and Lebanon, where you do not want to be now. You really don't. And so I just finished a long day of patrolling the ceasefire line, and I was about to actually head out for a run in the military camp when my phone rings. And it's one of my Swiss officers in Syria, and he's in distress. He tells me, Urs, we believe lives are on the line. There is stuff going down. Nobody's listening. We've tried everything. We tried to talk to our commanding officer, but nothing's moving. Can you help us in your role as Swiss senior national representative? And so I listened to some more background. I hang up. I tell him the next day there's a leadership meeting. I'll bring up his concerns then. So I hang up. I'm not happy. I now have to get the commanding officer in Syria into trouble by asking for a change in leadership because my Swiss officers deployed in Syria asking for that. I'm a newly minted senior, and I'm a lower ranking officer than everybody else at the senior leadership table. So I have to work double hard to be taken seriously. So the next day rolls around. I'm in this meeting. I lay out in no unclear terms the changes that my officers need to see. I'm being very Swiss, very dramatic, very to the point. But to my huge surprise, my low rank actually doesn't get me into trouble, and the concerns of my Swiss officers are immediately resolved almost on the spot. So after the meeting, I was reflecting on what made it possible for me to be heard at the highest level. And the short answer, I believe, is that up to this day, I was working incredibly hard on relationship building, on what I call being tender on people. So a few weeks earlier, when I was first promoted as senior, I knew to be effective, I needed to build collaborative relationships with key members in the mission, including everybody at the senior leadership table. So I literally pulled out the UN org chart, and I circled about 30 people who I knew I needed to build collaborative relationships with. And then I got to work. Of the next 10 days, I spent every hour I wasn't patrolling the ceasefire line on 30-minute get to know each other meetings. Wow. So I learned, no other business agenda. Talk to me about your background, your concerns and hopes for our mission, and your expectations of me as a senior. No other agenda. The head of mission and I, share a passion for my hometown in Zurich. The chief of staff and I share a passion for ultra endurance racing. Sharing with the vulnerability about our backgrounds, we moved from seniority to connection. And so even up to senior leadership, people were appreciative of me taking the time to get to know them a little bit. And so coming back to that senior leadership meeting, there's no question in my mind that the key reason why my voice was heard at the highest level is because I made the effort to get to know people individually before the famous stuff hits the fan, without the business agenda up front. And so it's a long story, I know, but the key here is that relationship building with a business purpose is one of the core elements of radical humility, actually leads to good results. And we don't build relationships because we want to be nice or liked, by the way. No, it builds trust, drives engagement, commitment. So and our feedback is much more likely to be heard and acted upon by both our teammates and our superiors if we've built meaningful on collaborative relationships. And the last thing I would say about this, I often get pushback. I don't have time for this stuff. Come on, I'm too busy. And I agree, it's never efficient in the short term, but we never know who we have to rely on when stuff gets really tough.
Yeah.
And so this relationship building is a preemptive move, and it helps to then, cut in.
Yeah.
There's lots of research, by the way, in crisis leadership, where strong relationships with key people are much more important than flow charts and detailed orders, because they can cut through the red tape and get right to the right person to get stuff done. So that's my little story about the value of relationship building with a business purpose at the UN and how it helped me to achieve strong results.
And I love that. And I wanted you to start off with that, because I think that says about your style again. As you said in the previous episode, you'd been 28 years out of the military. So when you started as a young 20-something, you wouldn't have known these things, but you built up that knowledge. And I think there's a lot there for young people to learn as well as old, in terms of, that relationship building from a core. And I think you said there, relationship building with purpose, understand what it's about. And you took time out, and there's no excuse of, I don't have time. The key is make the time to do it, because actually it's when you need it most, you probably put in that groundwork up front to enable you to do that work. And I love that as a story. And that's why I wanted to pick up on that in terms of your own attitude to just sharing and being open.
That's right. Yeah. No, and yeah, it's I often talk about, my most important currency as a leader is my time and my attention, right? And so and I, of course, I'm biased, right? But I strongly believe that the relationship aspect is, a core element of my leadership responsibility. There's a whole different story I could tell about Sir Ernest Shackleton, and his voyage, and how he gotten to know this in the 1910s. He gotten to know each of his crew members on a personal level, unheard of on English ships in 1910. Very much top-down command control. But Shackleton wanted to understand every crew member's strengths, weaknesses, and personal strengths.
I think that's amazing, actually. I've got a Shackleton book on my bookcase, and I've not read it for a number of years, actually. It's called Shackleton's Way. And I can see it in front of me down there. And I need to pick it up again, because actually there's a whole load of stories in there that I'd forgotten about. And I think you're right. That key thing in 1910, people didn't do that type of thing as we talk about. But actually, you're right. It's the key to leadership. It's the ones who did it are the ones who made the difference.
That's right. Yeah. If all else fails, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. Yeah. I love one of my closing stories in my keynote is about Shackleton's leadership. So I love his stuff.
Yeah, that's him. I love that. And interesting, actually, I think that's a good segue into the next piece, because I want to talk about, we talked there about, the 5 steps. You talk about tough on results, tender on people. You talk about leading like a compass. And one of those things there is about, the talent magnet piece, and the thing that attracts people to you. So I'd love you to touch on that before we go on the next journey about openness and honesty, which fits into vulnerability. But then I want to end up with the fearless culture, because I think obviously that's the bit we're trying to do, get to that fearless step. But let's come back in time. Talent magnet. Tell me about that, because this fits in with a lot of the stories we tell as our story about building the right teams around the right leader.
So, we all deal with, retention, the war for talent. So it's difficult to hire people and retain people. And so what I put forward is this concept of what I call a leadership factory, making it the explicit goal for each of my teams to produce the next generation of leaders for my organization. And so, people sometimes push back, well, if I make them even more employable, like they'll leave, right? And so the ironic truth, of course, is the more we challenge our good people, the more we push them to the next level, the longer they hang around. So we're tough on results, we prepare them for the next level, and we're tender on people by taking an interest in their career path. And so, when people in your team get promoted left and right, or move on to greener pastures, word gets around. If I'm on Phil's team, they go to the next level. I want to work for this guy. I'm going to line up to work for Phil. And so this is, when I talk about the notion also, which is somewhat related to this, making myself obsolete as a leader. So this is sort of, and again, there's always push back against this. I get it. It's easy for me as a consultant to talk about this. But the true test of leadership is how the ship runs when I'm not there. How can I make it so that the day-to-day runs without me being around? And so that's where this notion of becoming a leadership factory, preparing, and by the way, not everybody needs to become a manager and should become a manager, but subject expert, matter expert, a guru, you can promote, in inverted commas, your best individual contributors to become mentors, right? And so, so that's where I think the humility to know that I surround myself with hopefully people, by the way, they're smarter than me, people who take care of my weaknesses, people who compliment me, and I have enough confidence in myself that I'm able to do that. So
yeah, I love that. And it's interesting, actually, you said that that phrase, I love that you said about, you know, make them more employable, but they might leave. And I used to have a phrase on my website 15 years ago that said along the same lines, but it's actually, if you didn't make them employable, they might stay. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, our job is to make them more employable. We want them to go, and they go with our blessing, because actually it's our job to improve and get that A team into our places. And actually, as David Marquet says in Turn the Ship Around, you know, his job there was to build the team, and he didn't understand how to run that submarine, but he got in there and did it. And then the officers went on to run other ships in the US Navy because of his ability, and that generated that enthusiasm. I want to be part of his team.
Exactly right.
I love that. So I'm glad you talked about that, Aaron, because I think that's the key point. But let's just step into that next piece around, because we talked about vulnerability in the last episode, and we talked about how, you know, we all have to have the element of vulnerability, and that's the thing that puts it out there. But often there's a blockage in businesses, which is around that word psychological safety. Again, probably an overdone word, but I think we need to keep doing it. We need to keep talking about it, because too few businesses really value psychological safety. They talk a good game, but do nothing with it. So I'd love to think about that in terms of, you talk about building a fearless culture as the step there in terms of that championing it. But what does it take in your mind as a humble leader to enable psychological safety to thrive in your organization or in any organization you work with?
Right. So, and you're absolutely right, of course, you know, psychological safety is being thrown around a lot. It's all the research, just to be very clear, all the research out there shows crystal clear that psychological safety is the best predictor of a team's performance. You know, Google originally did the research, and it's now being confirmed across airline crews, the military, manufacturing, the whole shazam. So it's a better predictor for a team's performance than the size, the tenure of the team, and individual talent as well. So what does it take? So I have a little framework that is built on Amy Edmondson's work, who of course is the pioneer of psychological safety out of Harvard. And it starts with reframing failure for our team members. And I can talk in a second a bit more about that. Encouraging speaking up, and then acknowledging and thanking. Because what is psychological safety? Psychological safety, or a fearless team, is a team where everybody feels safe to speak up with questions and concerns without fear of being shamed. And so Amy Edmondson actually tells a wonderful story about the United Airlines captain. And the captain opens every crew members like so. I've never done a perfect flight before, and I'm going to prove it to you again today. So I need you. I need you to help me out when you see me do something wrong, because it will happen. And I will do the same for you. What does the captain do? The captain reframes failure. Hey, you and I, Phil, we fly a lot. You just flew back from Massachusetts, from Boston, presumably to London. There were mistakes on your flight. Mistakes happen on every single flight. So the captain reframes failure and then encourages speaking up. So the captain is hugging the messenger versus shooting the messenger, praising the messenger versus punishing the messengers, and in the process makes it safe for everybody on the crew to speak up when they see others make mistakes. So mistakes that are made by individuals, including the captain, the CEO of the plane, are caught by the collective, and the most important outcome improves, which is the safety of the flight. And so psychological safety, or fearless teams, quite literally can save lives. So it's about reframing failure. I'm not, by the way, saying having low standards. I can reframe failure for my teams and still have the highest standards, but acknowledge that stuff can and will happen. And it's important that we catch it, that we bring it to each other's attention, and that, of course, then we fix it. And so I have another sort of, to illustrate the point, one of my commanding officers in the Middle East opened an after-action review with these words. She said, "I screwed that up." Wow. And I know it. And here is what I'm going to do about it. Remember vulnerability in 3 acts? The third act is what am I going to do about it? So she modeled the behavior she wanted to see from all of her direct reports by going first. And so this particular after-action review, led to much better operations on the ground, all because she went first. So I screwed that up might actually be the most important 4 words we can say as leaders, because the best and most successful teams understand that being vulnerable together is the only way that the team can become invulnerable, even in the military. If you think about special operators, I do a little bit of coaching with special ops folks transitioning into the civilian career. They constantly tell each other they love each other. They constantly use the "I love you, brother." Like they are so tight and so vulnerable with each other, and that's why they're so strong.
Yeah.
Where were we? Psychological safety. Yeah, there you have it.
and I love that. And it's interesting, actually, because when you're telling me this, again, the model that comes to mind is Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. Yeah. And of course, what Pat talks about is building trust at that lower level. And that's the foundation of driving everything from accountability and commitment at the top. And I love what you're talking there about the special ops people saying, "I love you," because actually that's about vulnerability. That's because you're sharing so much with each other. And I think in business, we don't often have this. I work predominantly with scale-up businesses where they are, they are fast growth. They've got a vision. They've got an owner still in the leadership team. And actually, there's a big thing there about building that out there. And often business owners come to us when they get to 30, 40, or 50 employees, because then they think, "I don't know everybody in the team. How do I do that?" When I used to know everyone when they were sitting around my kitchen table working, but when I've grown it out. But actually, that key there is around, build that vulnerability and be vulnerable with everybody there. And I love those 4 words. I screwed up, or I screwed that up. I think that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Often we don't say that because we think we've got to know it all.
Right, exactly.
So I love that as a powerful thing. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So let's just fast forward in that case. In the last 10 minutes or so of this episode, I want to talk about 2 things here. And the first one is, how do we get this fearless culture? When you talk about building fearless teams, and there's lots of models we've got around this. And you talked about Amy Edmondson there. And again, being at Harvard last week, her name came up in a number of times in our sessions. But I think there's something good about how do we build those fearless teams? And you talk about listening. And you and I are both coaches. We know that listening is a key tool. But I wonder, what is it you've learned about yourself about listening that you didn't know before that you think you should share with people to help them listen better?
I think the thing that I'm still working on is actually, and as I mentioned earlier, or I think in the last episode, we're all work in progress, including myself, and especially with people I feel very close to really listen. And I know this is almost a cliche, with an open mind versus my own agenda. Do I listen to respond, especially with my kids, frankly? Do I listen to tell them what to do? Or do I really listen because I want to understand where they're coming from? And so I have a little model in the book on the 3 different levels of listening. So the first level of listening is very much me focused. So when we go to a restaurant and we listen to the waiter telling us the menu, that's level 1 listening, because it's all about me. Like, what am I going to order? Oh, I don't like this, I like that. So level 2 listening is then moving to really understand, where does Phil come from? What's going on for Phil as I listen to him? And what is his reality? And then the third level, which is really the highest level of listening, is contextual listening. So not just listening to the words, but listening to the energy, to what's not being said. Yeah. So you asked me, what have I learned? So I'm still, especially as I mentioned, with people I feel super close with, working on moving away from level 1 and 2 towards level 3 listening.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I love that thing about that contextual listening, because that's where the energy is. And I think you're right. We are all guilty of listening at level 1 when we should be listening at level 3. And I think it's that focus around me focus to other focus. And I think you talked about stakeholder coaching or stakeholder center coaching. I think there's a big thing there about, listening at that level is what really distinguishes the coach from just the general leader. And I think there's a big thing there that we all can learn to do even better.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So interesting, isn't it? How do we go about teaching these things? And I think this is the big point for me is, as a coach, I've been working as a coach now for 15 or so years, thinking about that, I had to think then. And I think we often can slip back into that with our families, and coaching your families is one of the hardest things that anybody knows. And you talked there about your 2 teenage sons, and you said earlier in the previous episode that you had promised you wouldn't go and do another mission whilst they were still in high school, but at some stage you're going to do that next mission because that's what's in you, and that's the thing that brings you about. So I'd love to talk about education, because I think we talk about listening and we talk about educating people. You said something here previously to me about the role of education in reducing conflict and the challenges of maintaining a growth mindset and the impact of different leadership styles. But I wonder, how do we go about educating people, especially those close to us, on some of these new ways of thinking that will help build radical humility? That's a big question.
That's a big question. So that's what I'm trying to do, Phil. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get, and I'm sure you do the same, I'm trying to get the message across in whichever way feels right to me. And so what that shows up for, like, it shows up differently for everybody. Like, I happen to write a book. Okay, so that's one tool out there.
Yeah.
And then we do podcasts, we speak, we coach. That's all externally focused and important. And, we have a platform and we better put it to good use. I would love to see some of what we're talking about today being incorporated more into, you talked about education, into the curriculum at schools. I see some of that in some of the good private schools in the States.
Okay.
Some of the good, I think you have it different in the UK. The private schools are the public schools and vice versa or something, isn't that?
Yeah, exactly. So we call our private schools public schools. That's the
That's right.
It's always confusing for a lot of people. Yeah.
So, but even in the States here, in some of the good public schools, growth mindset. My kids were taught in elementary school growth mindset. They understand exactly what that means, and that's brilliant. So this is all externally focused, but importantly, I think even more powerful is how we choose to live our lives. Like, what do we show up with? What are the projects we take on, and how do we execute them? So this is not teaching, this is modeling, this is demonstrating. And so so those are the 2 avenues I try to get my message across.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's interesting is that modeling, so it's the Gandhi phrase of be the change you want to see in the world. And I think at the end of the day, we can all talk a good game, but you're acting a good game as well. You're out there doing it. And a bit like you were saying with your father taking the 3 months going to work in Somalia, that gave you an education at an early age of what other people do. And that just became a bit of who you are, basically.
Right.
So I love that thing about, how we choose to live our lives and that modeling. And I think there's a key piece there. And if you think about, the world we're in at the moment, and you talked about, working on the border of Lebanon and Israel at the time, and we know what's going on there at the moment, and there's a lot of difficulty there. And at the end of the day, I believe that through sharing these type of messages, we can start these changes. You say, through our podcasting, we can get out to many millions of people. There's something there in terms of just spreading the word and talking about these things and acting the way you want to be doing, which I think is key to it. So I love your approach to it. And interestingly, as I come to a wrap up here, I've got one final bit there. You talked to me last time that you're already transitioning your own business into this purpose-driven business. You talked here about your purpose and as an individual and how that fits you in terms of making your own contribution to a better world. But I think from a business perspective, you've got some key things that you work on there. And I think that's a real admirable thing for you about what you do and how you spread your message out there.
Yeah, so so this is something that I'm still working on, exactly how the messaging is going to look like. But I'm in the very privileged position, and I'm not shy to say that I don't actually have to work for money. So I can give back, and it's very tempting to always want more, no matter how much you have. But I can provide for those who I love and live the lifestyle I want. So I'm actually donating all my top line revenue, speaking and book royalties, to a good cause. And I've honed in on Junior Achievement Africa. So it's a youth empowerment organization that works globally. But because of my keen interest in conflict zones, I'm honing in on Junior Achievement Africa, that work on financial literacy, work skills, entrepreneurship for youth in Africa. So yes, that's what I'm doing. I'm giving back to a cause that I believe in, empowering youth in conflict zones. And so it is my own way to try and make a small impact beyond the stage, beyond the platform that you and I both have, Phil.
Wow, that's amazing. And I admire you for saying that, actually. And again, there's a number of bits of vulnerability you've put out there straight away, in terms of, as you said, you don't need to do this for money, but you're doing it because you enjoy it. But actually the key is you're doing it to spread the message. So I admire you for doing it. And if I can contribute and help in any way on that, just let me know, because I think there's a whole movement there. So thank you.
Thanks.
I've got one final question for you in that case. And I was thinking about what to end this podcast with. And the question I'm going to ask you is, if you could go back and give the young Urs one piece of advice, what would it be?
Be even more, this is going to sound even more ruthless in radical in pursuing what truly drives you and makes you happy, and think less about how others will think about it and how it will land with others.
Wow. That's powerful. I think there's something that's words of wisdom there.
Well, to myself primarily, right?
Exactly. And as you say, we all have different opinions on things. Other people might disagree, but actually that's the key. And I saw you taking time to think about that. And I didn't preempt you on that as well. So thank you.
No, you didn't.
for doing that.
Absolutely.
So there'll be a number of people wanted to contact you and find out who you are. And I know you talked about your speaking engagements, obviously the book, which I'll come back to again. We'll put these notes in the show notes, but where would people find you? What's the best way to locate you, to link with you, to connect with you?
So, obviously my website at urskoenig.com, and then the one social platform I'm very active on is LinkedIn. So I'd love to connect on LinkedIn and continue the conversation there. So those two places.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Well, Urs Koenig, thank you. It's been a pleasure on these two episodes. I've loved it. It's a great conversation. And over time, I'd love the opportunity to have another conversation with you as we build and develop, because I think there's loads more questions I could ask. And offline, I'd love to more talk to you about our endurance sport and the aging process of doing more as we get older. But that's for another day. But for today, thank you very much, Urs Koenig. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish you well, and I look forward to hearing more about your journey and hearing how your purpose comes to life in future.
Thank you, Phil. I had a lot of fun. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you.